the UN systems made enormous progress in implementing DRR, disaster risk reduction approaches across agencies. There are now a number of agencies that have mainstreamed DRR. FAO is probably the most prominent example where disaster risk reduction linked to resilience has now been incorporated fundamentally as a strategic priority across the agency's work. But countries, focusing on countries, there are some countries that have made tremendous progress, others that have big gaps, and often those are countries that are less developed, and therefore there's a resource constraints and other challenges, the usual set of challenges. So we've made some progress, we have a long way to go. With climate change, we expect the incidence of disasters to increase and the severity to increase over time. So if we're not meeting the need now, it's going to be impossible to meet the need by simply responding to disasters. We have to prevent risk rather than responding. Rather than managing disasters, we have to get out in front of this. And there are a number of studies that have shown that, that you have a 4-to-1 benefit. In other words, if you focus on prevention, it's 4 times more effective. You meet 4 times the need and prevent disaster relative to simply responding after the disaster's happened. Of course, you also save countless lives in doing so. If you're making choices about how to spend money, do you understand the risks and what the current disasters or the history and what disasters are currently costing? Whether it's a humanitarian disaster or a development-related one, for example, building a bridge or building buildings in a floodplain where it's more vulnerable. Those are disaster that's creating risk. And so DRR is essentially bridging the gap by saying, let's look comprehensively at risk and disasters, look at what it's cost us in the past, and incorporate risk and choices within development planning, both humanitarian and development planning. Humanitarian, things like building back better, having early warning systems in place, development planning in terms of the choices governments make about what to invest and where. Very concerned about El Nino and La Nina, its counterpart. El Nino is now happening on the back of global warming. And there are many studies, scientific studies, that suggest that the frequency and severity of El Nino and La Nina events will increase with climate change. These events, which are part of natural variability in our climate, even without climate change, have huge humanitarian impacts on agriculture, whether it's droughts in some places, flooding in others, in an El Nino, and then it's almost the opposite, the actual reverse in a La Nina. Places that were experiencing drought in El Nino experience floods in La Nina. But these have huge impacts on food security. So it is a deeply worrying development linked to climate change, and it means that our challenge in incorporating disaster risk reduction is even greater and more important. The first thing that needs to be done is we need to mitigate climate change, because if the temperature continues to increase, whatever we try and do to help farmers is not going to be enough over time. If we go to 3 or 4 degrees of warming, Celsius of warming, it will simply overcome the capacity of particularly rural, poor communities to cope with that challenge. So that needs to happen fundamentally. Secondly, we have to incorporate disaster risk in planning and in choices of the investments we're making. For example, investments in irrigation, in drought-resistant crops, in social safety nets for poor communities, in alternative income sources. All these elements that are fundamental to helping a community, a farming community in a rural area, become more resilient to these very disturbing trends that we're seeing.